In this video, as we continue our series on the rise and fall of Satan, we're addressing a critical question. Why do Christians believe things about the chief rebel, Satan, that aren't found in the Old Testament? The Old Testament never describes Satan as the god of this world, the ruler of unclean spirits, or someone destined for eternal fire. So where do these ideas come from if they're not in the Old Testament? The figure of Mastema in Second Temple Jewish literature, particularly in the book of Jubilees, helps bridge the gap between the Old Testament and New Testament understanding of the chief rebel. Mastema is depicted as a leader of evil spirits, a tempter, and an adversary who acts against God's people, much like Satan in the New Testament. He commands a host of unclean spirits and is associated with leading humanity into sin and into rebellion. This development in the intertestamental period provides the foundation for the New Testament's portrayal of Satan as the ruler of unclean spirits, the god of this world, and one ultimately destined for judgment. Join pastor and seasoned apologist Grant Forrester and me as we explore how these developments shaped the New Testament's portrayal of Satan and what it means for understanding the Bible as a whole. I'm Kevin Laymon, a pastor and Christian therapist. This is Veiled Kingdoms. Let's pierce the veil.
So we're smack in the middle of talking about Hebrew words that all of a sudden become persons in the New Testament and in the intertestamental period. And so the word we're going to look at today is hostility, which the Hebrew word is Mastema. Okay. This word pops up in Hosea chapter 9, 7 through 8. This is, again, this Hebrew word Mastema is going to all of a sudden become a person in the intertestamental period. And so Hosea 9, 7 through 8 says this: "The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Let Israel know this. The prophet is an ignorant fool. The inspired man has madness because of the abundance of your iniquity and because your hostility," okay, that's Mastema, has abounded. "Ephraim was a watchman with my God, a prophet, yet the snare of a bird catcher is in all his ways, and there is only hostility in the house of his God."
Wow, okay.
Mastema.
Yeah.
Okay. The intertestamental writers and sort of thinkers and theologians, again, which I would argue are faithful Jews trying to understand the world they live in and the scriptures they have, see in this word an opportunity to describe rebels in the unseen realm, but particularly a chief rebel in the unseen realm. And so we're going to look at the book of Jubilees today. This is really the main place that Mastema shows up. And we're going to look at Jubilees chapter 10 and chapter 48.
Okay.
But the main section is in chapter 10. This is really interesting story. This is around the time of the flood. Right after the flood happens, Noah and his kids, they start having kids, and their kids have kids, and they start spread it out right before the Tower of Babel. And Noah comes to God in prayer, and he says, all of my descendants are being attacked by unclean spirits. All the giants that you just wiped out in the flood, all of their spirits are tormenting my kids.
Okay.
Please help. And what the Lord does is he says, well, I'll get rid of all of them. And then Mastema comes to God and says, can I have some of them, please?
Oh my God. What?
It's a wild story.
Yeah.
It's a wild story. So I'm going to connect us first to what we were talking about the last episode, okay? In the War Scroll, chapters 13, 10 through 12, we connect Belial and the angel Mastema, okay? It says, "You created Belial for the pit, the angel Mastema. His domain is darkness. His counsel is for evil and wickedness." Okay. So same guy, Belial and Mastema. Well, now we have a development on Mastema, which would also be a development on Belial. And on Satan. And we're going to see Mastema explicitly connected to Satan right here.
And so again, for those who are just coming in and this is the first video they've ever watched with us, we're showing the progression of how we go from the Old Testament, where there's just this idea of the Nahash, to him being known as a particular person, Satan, in the New Testament. And there's all of these links in this chain that are in the intertestamental period that we don't see unless we actually study this stuff. But we're looking at how that thought, that development in really theology, Satanology, I don't know what we would call it, but that development in who he was, who this chief rebel is, how that transitions into the New Testament.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, spot on. And the way they do that is by taking what seems like benign Hebrew words, making them into persons in this intertestamental period, and then saying these persons are Satan.
This person. Okay.
Yeah, they're using these Hebrew words to describe Satan. That's good.
Okay.
And so we're going to do Jubilees 10, 7 through 13, and I think you've got 7 through 9.
Okay, let's jump in. And the Lord our God spoke to us being the archangels, so that we might bind all of them. And the chief of the spirits, Mastema, came and he said, O Lord Creator, leave some of them before me and let them obey my voice.
And the them is the unclean spirits.
Okay.
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And let them do everything which I will tell them, because if some of them are not left for me, I will not be able to exercise the authority of my will among the children of men, because they are intended to corrupt and lead astray before my judgment, because the evil of the sons of men is great. And he said, let a tenth of them remain before him, but let 9 parts go down into the place of judgment.
So this is a great example of where some thinkers and scholars would look and say, hey, this is a great example to go right alongside of the conversation of Job 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3.
Yeah.
Mastema, Satan, is in the throne room of God and asking him to let God keep some of the demons on the earth so that he can have access to them.
Yeah.
Interesting tidbit there. So the 10th language is important because that's what's going to connect Mastema to Satan. This passage is important because it's one of the places that academics or scholars will go to when they're debating on what is this being in Job 1 and 2 and in Zechariah 3, that it's capital S Satan. Now, we covered this already. The Hebrew really is just the Satan, lowercase s. We shouldn't capitalize the S, but for people wanting to make the argument that the being in Job 1 and 2 and in Zechariah 3, they're like, this is the Nahash. This is some of the connections that they're going to use to make that. Okay. But this 10th language is important because, as we're going to see in just a second, this is what connects him to Satan. So this is verses 10 through 13. And he told one of us to teach Noah all of their healing, because he knew that they would not walk uprightly and would not strive righteously. And we acted in accord with all of his words. All of the evil ones who were cruel, we bound in the place of judgment, but a tenth of them we let remain, so that they might be subject to Satan upon the earth. Right? And who was asking for those just a second ago? Mastema.
Yes.
Now it is saying that they will be subject to Satan.
I see.
Same person.
Same person.
Same person. And the healing of their illnesses together with their seductions, we told Noah so that he might heal by means of herbs on the earth. And Noah wrote everything in a book, just as we taught him, according to every kind of healing. And the evil spirits were restrained from following the sons of Noah. And so Noah's prayers are answered.
Okay. Quick question. Because I feel like somebody's going to ask this.
Ooh.
How do we know that in this, when it says that they might be subject to Satan upon the earth, how do we know that this is now a proper noun and he's not just saying they will be subject to an adversary on the earth?
That's good, because the Hebrew doesn't lend itself to that. When we're looking at it in the Hebrew, they are using it as a name, just like they're using the word Mastema as a name.
Okay.
Like when you're reading in Mastema, it doesn't say, and the chief of the spirits, wickedness, right? It says, and the chief of the spirits, Mastema.
Okay.
So one of the key themes in the intertestamental period is the personification of these Hebrew words.
So the understanding is in the context of the way these are written.
Yeah.
It's clear in the Hebrew that they're being used as names, whereas you would say in Job 1 and 2 or 1 Chronicles 21 that it is not clear.
That's right. And so just like
and they wouldn't have even had the idea to begin with to do that, whereas here we're actually watching the development of that idea unfold before us.
Yeah, you should expect to see it here. It's not going to happen in the Old Testament. And so what's not happening is, it says in verse 8, and the chief of the spirits, enmity, came and he said, like, that's not what's happening. They are being used as names at this point.
Sure.
And so Belial, Mastema, Azazel, Satan, the word Satan is now being used as a name.
Because there's a particular designation that's being like they're using,
like the word grant just means a promise.
Yeah.
Right. But nobody walks around and goes, oh, hey, a promise.
Yeah.
They're like, hey, grant. Like, we know how that word is being used. The same thing is true here. This is where this development happens. And so, which is why in the New Testament, it's not surprising that Jesus is running around and using the word adversary in Hebrew as a name. Right. Satanas.
Right.
He's not transliterating Satanas as just adversary. He means a particular being.
Right. That thought wasn't developed until the intertestamental period.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
And we'll tie more of this together in the next episode too. When we start looking at him being connected to the serpent, and we start trying to tie this web together.
Okay.
Because we know for sure that in the New Testament, the word Satan, Satanas, is a name.
Sure.
It's everywhere that way, regardless of how it's translated. Ho Satanas or just Satanas.
Okay.
They mean it as a name. Question is, where is that coming from? Because it's certainly not in the Old Testament. This is where that's happening. So that's why like English translators of these passages are going to use it in a capital S, even though they do already do that in the Old Testament, is because this is the place that that's actually happening.
Right.
Is that they are talking about a particular being.
Okay.
And so they were made subject to Satan upon the earth, or Satanas in the Greek. And if you want to know more about this, this passage from Jubilees 10, 7 through 13, Heiser covers in his book on demons on pages 96 and 97.
Okay.
So if you have that, you can go check out.
Yeah.
So Mastema is seen as Satan here in the intertestamental period, but there's a little bit more that we can learn from Jubilees about how they understood this being Satan. What we're going to look at now is sort of like with Belial, that this being was over other spiritual beings, or at least they understood in the intertestamental period, they understood that this being was sort of pulling the strings. And we're going to look at the story of the Exodus. What we're going to see in Jubilees is that Mastema is the one who's sort of pulling the strings with all of the demonic, all of the evil spirits. That's not exactly, again, Jubilees isn't scripture. Exodus is scripture, Jubilees is not. But what we want to note is that they were thinking while they were writing Jubilees that this chief rebel is somehow behind the scenes doing all of the stuff in Exodus. So in Exodus, it says in Exodus 12:12, he says, all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. Okay, not singular. All the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. But in Jubilees 48, when they're sort of processing this and they're in the story, it says that Prince Mastema desired to do all of these things, okay? We're going to read 1 through 4. If you want to read verses 1 and 2, you can take it away.
Yeah, sure. And in the 6th year of the 3rd week of the 49th Jubilee, you departed and dwelled in the land of Midian 5 weeks and 1 year. And you returned into Egypt in the 2nd week, in the 2nd year, in the 50.
Dude, I love
wherever we are in time.
Yeah, that's right. Oh my gosh, yeah.
All right. And you returned to Egypt in the 2nd week, in the 2nd year, in the 50th Jubilee, and you yourself know what he said to you on Mount Sinai, and what Prince Mastema desired to do with you when you were returning into Egypt on the way when you met him at the lodging place.
Okay, a lot going on.
Yes.
And so in the story of the Exodus, it says that Yahweh tried to kill Moses for not circumcising his son.
Yes.
And his wife Zipporah had to quickly circumcise his son so that Moses didn't get killed by the wrath of God. In Jubilees, even actions that Yahweh is doing are attributed to Mastema. Okay. Not scripture. That is not what's happening. That's a direct contradiction to what's happening in actual scripture. So we just throw that out. But what's the thing that we can recognize is that they're still trying to process this chief rebel idea. And so maybe they're thinking the chief rebel is like God's executioner.
I see.
Right?
Right.
That would make Yahweh kind of dirty. That Yahweh is somehow like under the table, like paying this evil, wicked thing to do his work. Like that's not,
so that
that's not a good picture.
Yeah.
It's not a good picture.
Yeah.
If Yahweh is going to do something, it's a righteous thing and he's going to do it. He doesn't need some evil spirit to do it for him.
But you can see how that thought would, they're trying to
they're
justify
processing.
all,
That's right. They're processing. And so they're wrestling with like really important questions like, why do evil things happen?
Right. Which is why we can use it as a resource, but we don't use it as authority of scripture.
That's exactly right. And so verses 3 and 4, did he not, this is Mastema, did Mastema not with all his power seek to slay you and deliver the Egyptians out of your hand when he saw that you were sent to execute judgment and vengeance on the Egyptians?
Yeah.
Now, in the book Exodus, the gods are the ones that are trying to do that.
I see.
Not Mastema. And so they attribute Mastema here. And then Yahweh continues, and I delivered you out of his hand. Not, I delivered you out of the gods of Egypt's hand. But that's not the language we see in Exodus. And so they're sort of taking the gods of Egypt and then consolidating it into one person. The theme that comes out of this is there's a being that is over these other beings. The gods of Egypt are there, which this is the development that we pick up on in the New Testament. Like when Paul says there are many gods and many lords. But there's this one being that's sort of pulling all the strings, and so they attribute all of this nastiness to Mastema.
Okay.
And so he says, and I delivered you out of his hand, and you performed the signs and wonders which you were sent to perform in Egypt against Pharaoh and against all his house and against his servants and his people.
Okay. Yeah. Very good.
The takeaway for this is that the Hebrew word, just like we've been doing, right? Satan means adversary. All of a sudden, Satan is a person in the intertestamental period because they're developing this idea. And then Satan is a person in the New Testament. And then we have Belial means vile. And then Belial is a person in the intertestamental period. And then Belial is used as a proper name in 2 Corinthians. And then Mastema is the word for enmity or hostility. And then Mastema is a person. And then Mastema is used as a character description for Satan in the New Testament. He's the enemy of, and he comes to kill and steal and destroy. All of this character profile of the chief rebel is really being worked on and chewed on in this intertestamental period. And then a lot of that stuff is then verified just right out of the mouth of God himself, Christ, in the New Testament,
right?
And his followers. And so,
love that.
And so the Hebrew word wickedness took on all manner of meaning and significance in the intertestamental period. And so the Hebrew word was personified and then connected to another Hebrew word, Satan, which just means adversary. But this connection in the Second Temple Jewish thought produced what we see in the New Testament. And so the New Testament is clear, certain about this. Satan is a being, and he's the chief rebel. He's the serpent of old. He's the dragon. He's the prince of these demons, the prince of darkness, and he's going to be cast in eternal fire. All of that, which the New Testament says, yep, this stuff is true, really begins to cook in the crock pot in the intertestamental period. But we don't know that unless you start studying this stuff, which is becoming more popular. People are getting into these things, but you don't know that unless you look there. But there is more yet. So come back next time and you'll see all these webs come together, like I was talking a minute ago, and we'll see sort of how this figure sort of becomes sort of the final piece to the puzzle, how this figure sort of becomes what he is in the New Testament. But there's so much more behind the veil.
Yeah, and I am so much looking forward to continuing to pierce that veil. But for today, that's all we have for which we have time for. If you're still with us, we have to assume this has been helpful to you. Please consider giving a like to the video or subscribe to the channel. If you're new here, we have tons of content that you could go back and check out. There's some good stuff in there. Grant, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely, bro. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for listening, and God bless.